for one single yesterday, holding Bobby's body.
At 92 years old, Willie Nelson isn't just a country music legend. He is living proof that scars can sing, that storms can shape art, and that a man can turn betrayal into beauty with nothing more than a voice and a guitar. For decades, he's been celebrated as the outlaw poet who gave the world on the road. Again and always on my mind, songs that seem to float through time like warm memories. Yet behind those gentle melodies lies a man who endured more storms than most could survive. From abandonment as a child to rejection from Nashville, from heartbreaks that tore families apart to financial disasters that would have destroyed anyone else, Nelson carried his burdens not in silence, but in song, building a legacy that speaks louder because it comes from pain. At 92, while most would choose to rest, he still tours, still records, and still faces each day with the quiet resilience of someone who knows that rest was never promised to him in the first place. But here's the mystery that grips his story tighter than ever. Behind the calm smile, there is still weight, unspoken truths, and a legacy that continues to be tested even in his final years. What is it that keeps this man standing when storms should have long swept him away? What secrets hide behind those weary eyes and gentle words? And why, even after decades of fame and survival, do his final chapters feel like the most powerful yet? This isn't just the tale of a singer at the twilight of life. It's a revelation of how far a soul can bend without breaking, and the haunting truth that Willie Nelson's story at 92 may be his most unforgettable act of all. Long before he was the outlaw king of country music, Willie Nelson was simply a forgotten child in the dust of Abbott, Texas, born in 1933 into a family that didn't stay to raise him. His mother disappeared first, leaving no note, no farewell, just silence and absence that a baby couldn't understand, but would never forget. His father remarried and vanished too, and so Willie and his sister Bobby were left in the care of poor but kind-hearted grandparents who tried to patch the holes left in two children no one else wanted to claim. His grandfather, a blacksmith, placed a guitar into Willie's tiny hands, becoming the boy's first anchor in a world of shifting ground. But tragedy came quickly. When Willie was only 6 years old, pneumonia stole his grandfather away, and the one figure who had given him stability was gone forever. In his autobiography, Nelson described the pain of knowing his parents were still alive somewhere in the world, but simply uninterested in him, a wound he called worse than death because it was abandonment without closure. By the time he was 7, other children played with toys, but Willie clung to a guitar as if it were oxygen, strumming chords not for fun but to drown the silence that weighed on him. At 9, he was already playing in local bars, turning pain into sound and sound into survival. Nights that should have been filled with bedtime stories were spent on stages where the applause wasn't for fame. It was for connection, for proof that someone could hear him. Every melody he created in those early years was stitched from hunger, grief, and the gnawing ache of loneliness. These were not just childhood hardships, they were the seeds of a career built on resilience. And perhaps that is why, even at 92, every note Willie Nelson sings still carries the echo of a boy crying out to be loved, proof that some storms never leave, they only teach you how to sing through them. The Texas sun doesn't just shine, it punishes. And for a teenage Willie Nelson, that relentless heat became a daily adversary as he bent over cotton fields with blistered fingers, aching back, and the stubborn determination of someone too young to quit, yet too old to be carefree. By the time he was 14, Willie had cycled through more jobs than many grown men. Tree trimmer, phone operator, nightclub bouncer, encyclopedia salesman, disc jockey, dishwasher, anything that kept a little food on the table and a little hope alive. He recalled later the absurdity of selling $600 encyclopedias door to door to families who could barely afford a meal, a reminder that survival in those days was often less about fairness and more about endurance. At night, he played in bars for a few dollars, spinning country tunes on dusty turntables during the day, and often slept on floors, in cars, or sometimes not at all. Nashville, the dreamland of every country musician, wasn't a golden ticket. For Willie, it was a fortress with its gates slammed in his face. Time and again, record labels turned him away, dismissing his voice as too rough, too raw, too weathered for radio. Producers wanted polished rhinestones and crooners with smooth pompadours, not a weary-eyed drifter with braids and gravel in his throat. But even as doors shut and nights grew colder, Nelson clung to his guitar like it was oxygen, scribbling lyrics that would one day define American music, even if no one cared to listen then. This was not ambition in the glamorous sense. It was survival through song, a refusal to let silence win. Each odd job, each rejection, each night spent on borrowed couches only added grit to a man who understood that sometimes the road to greatness isn't paved at all. It's walked barefoot through fire until the world has no choice but to listen. Yet even the strongest wanderer can stumble into despair, and in his 20s, Willie Nelson came frighteningly close to giving up altogether. Living in a broken-down trailer on the edge of a cemetery near Nashville, weighed down by rejection, failures, and the haze of too many nights numbing himself with alcohol, he reached what he would later call one of his darkest points. One night, consumed by hopelessness, Willie walked into the middle of a busy street and lay down, not as a protest but because he simply didn't know what else to do. Cars veered past him as if he were invisible. A man sprawled on asphalt, ignored by the very world that had shut its doors on him. Was I relieved? Was I disappointed? Can't say for sure, he later admitted when recalling that night. Somehow, he stood back up, returned to the bar, and carried on breathing. Not because he saw hope, but because he couldn't bear to quit. A short time later, trying to hitchhike to Portland in search of the mother who had abandoned him, he curled up in a roadside ditch when no one stopped to help, rain soaking his clothes as he wondered how much lower life could go. Then a truck driver pulled over, handed him $10 and gave him a ride to the bus station. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A lifeline in a moment when he thought he had none. Willie would later describe those years as a long storm, a time without shelter, applause, or compass. But what he discovered inside that storm was the one truth that carried him forward. Music was all he had, and it had to be enough. For some, that night on the road could have been the end, a story cut short before it truly began. For Willie Nelson, it became the invisible hinge on which his legend would swing, proof that sometimes survival itself is the strongest form of rebellion. When Nashville kept slamming the doors in his face, Willie Nelson didn't stop writing. He simply handed his songs to others, and in doing so, he carved out a strange existence as a ghostwriter of American classics. In 1959, desperate for money, with a baby on the way, Willie sold the rights to his gospel ballad Family Bible for just $100. And while the song became a radio staple for Claude Gray, Nelson's name wasn't even on the label. The applause, the fame, the recognition, all went to someone else, leaving Willie invisible in the very world he was helping to define. Then came Crazy, a haunting melody drawn from the deepest corners of longing, which soared to eternal fame through the voice of Patsy Cline, becoming one of the most played jukebox songs in history. Funny How Time Slips Away was carried to stardom by Billy Walker. Pretty Paper found its voice through Roy Orbison. And all the while, Willie's own voice was dismissed as too raw, too weathered, too unmarketable. Imagine writing the emotional architecture of a generation, only to serve drinks at a bar while your words floated through the air on someone else's tongue. Producers told him flat out he didn't have the right look or the polished voice for radio, ignoring the soul in his gravel and the poetry in his weariness. For most, that would have been the end, a man erased from his own work. But Nelson kept writing, giving away masterpieces even as pieces of himself disappeared into the spotlight of others. Each hit stolen by another singer cut deep, but it also carved the determination that one day he would not just write the truth, he would sing it himself. This was heartbreak disguised as success, a cruel twist where brilliance was rewarded with invisibility. Yet it planted the seed of defiance that would eventually set Willie Nelson apart as the outlaw voice America never knew it needed, until he forced them to listen. By the early 1970s, Nashville had made its verdict clear. Willie Nelson did not belong. His ranch in Ridgetop had burned to the ground. His marriage to Shirley Colley had collapsed in scandal. RCA had dropped him, and critics wrote him off as finished at just 39 years old. For many, this would have been the final chapter, a quiet fade into obscurity. But instead it became the turning point that transformed him into something far greater than Nashville could have ever imagined. Packing up the ashes of his old life, Willie returned to Texas and stumbled into Austin's music scene, a wild, chaotic crossroads where long-haired hippies sat beside rodeo cowboys in smoky bars and backyard stages. Unlike Nashville's rigid suits and rhinestone expectations, Austin cared only about authenticity. They didn't ask if you fit the mold, they asked if you sounded real. For the first time, Willie's rough edges weren't a liability. They were the very thing that drew people in. In 1973, he released Shotgun Willie, a ragged, unapologetic album that critics called unpolished but fans called truth. And suddenly, the outlaw had a microphone of his own. 2 years later came Red-Headed Stranger, a stripped-down concept album Columbia Records almost didn't release, fearing it was too sparse, too strange, too quiet to succeed. But fans leaned in to listen, and it became a masterpiece, proof that Nelson didn't need gloss or approval to make history. He joined forces with Waylon Jennings, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glaser to record Wanted. The Outlaws, the first country album to go platinum, and in doing so, he flipped the industry upside down. The man Nashville had dismissed as unmarketable became the face of outlaw country, not because he changed to fit them, but because he refused to. By choosing truth over polish, Willie Nelson didn't just find redemption. He built a movement that gave every misfit, drifter, and rebel permission to sing their story without apology. By the mid-1970s, Willie Nelson had finally done what Nashville swore he never could. He became the voice of a generation, not by conforming but by rebelling. His braids, his bandanas, his laid-back drawl, and his unabashed use of marijuana turned him into the poster child of a new movement, outlaw country, and fans loved him not in spite of his roughness, but because of it. Alongside Waylon Jennings, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glaser, he redefined what country music could be with Wanted. The Outlaws, the first country album to ever sell over 1 million copies. He stood on stage with the swagger of a man who no longer begged for a seat at the table. He had built his own table and the crowds came to him. Yet behind the applause, Nelson's personal life unraveled in ways that fame couldn't shield. At the time, he was still married to Shirley Colley, but the truth was already breaking through the seams. One day, Shirley accidentally opened a hospital bill addressed to someone else, and what she found inside was devastating. Charges for the delivery of a baby girl born to Mrs. Connie Nelson. In an instant, the secret affair was exposed, and Willie had to admit that Connie Kopke was his girlfriend, and Paula was their daughter. For Shirley, this wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation written in ink. Their marriage collapsed under the weight of secrets that no apology could erase. Willie later joked, "There's no such thing as ex-wives, only additional ones." But beneath the humor lay exhaustion, guilt, and the ache of too many broken promises. Fame had given him freedom, but it had also magnified the cost of his choices. He had become a symbol of rebellion to the world, but at home he was a man haunted by betrayals and losses, proving that even outlaws can't outrun the storms that come from within. If the 1970s gave Willie Nelson freedom, the 1990s nearly took everything away. Just when it seemed he had weathered every personal storm, a new one arrived in the form of a cold, official letter from the Internal Revenue Service demanding an impossible $16.7 million in unpaid taxes. Years of financial mismanagement, shady advisors, and blind trust had caught up with him, and in one sweep, federal agents raided his ranch, seized his recording equipment, and even tried to claim Trigger, his beloved guitar that had carried him through decades of storms. For a man who had already lost so much, it was almost unbearable to watch his life boxed up and carried out the door. But Nelson did what he had always done when the world knocked him flat. He turned to music. In 1992, he recorded the IRS tapes, Who'll Buy My Memories, an album stripped of glitz, recorded with just his voice and guitar, sold directly through late-night infomercials. The concept was raw and honest, a man offering up his past to buy back his future. At first it seemed like a desperate gimmick, but something remarkable happened. America listened. Fans rallied behind him, not out of pity but out of loyalty, remembering the songs he had given them during their loneliest nights, and now choosing to give back. Slowly, dollar by dollar, Nelson chipped away at the debt, until most of it was paid. He refused to declare bankruptcy, refused to hide behind lawyers, instead standing in front of his audience and singing his way out of ruin. By the mid-1990s, he had regained Trigger, regained his dignity, and reminded the world that resilience is louder than ruin. For most artists, the IRS debacle would have been the end, a sad footnote in a once glorious career. For Willie Nelson, it became yet another chapter in a saga defined not by how many times he fell, but by how many times he got back up, guitar in hand, ready to sing again. Even after clawing his way back from the IRS nightmare, Willie Nelson could not escape the one storm that no amount of music or resilience could silence: the loss of family. On Christmas Day in 1991, while millions celebrated with joy and light, Nelson's world darkened when his son Billy was found dead, a tragedy that carved a scar deeper than any financial ruin or career rejection. Willie had already known abandonment, betrayal, and rejection, but nothing prepared him for the ache of burying a child. For a man who had filled silence with music his entire life, this grief was nearly unspeakable, a wound so profound that even lyrics struggled to contain it. Yet he did what he had always done. He carried the weight quietly, channeling sorrow into song, and stepping back onto stages not to celebrate, but to survive. Over the years, other losses followed. Friends, collaborators, and fellow outlaws like Waylon Jennings and Merle Haggard, each departure leaving the world of country music a little emptier. Nelson never grieved loudly. He let his songs whisper what his heart could not shout. When asked about pain, he often deflected with humor or a shrug. But behind the jokes and the braids was a man who had lived through more funerals than encores, a survivor who understood that some wounds never heal. They only become part of you. And yet through all of it, he never stopped touring, never stopped writing. Because music wasn't just his livelihood. It was his therapy, his survival, the rope that kept him tethered when grief threatened to pull him under. For every fan who saw Willie smile from the stage, few knew the storms he had carried with him to get there. Proof that even legends bleed in silence, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply walking forward when the world behind you has crumbled. Now, at 92 years old, Willie Nelson stands as both a survivor and a symbol. A man who has endured abandonment, rejection, betrayal, financial ruin, and devastating grief, yet still chooses to stand under the spotlight with his guitar trigger in hand. Most men his age would have retired long ago, content to fade into the quiet comfort of family and rest. But Willie is not most men. Even in his 90s, he continues to tour, to record, and to live as though music is still the only oxygen he knows how to breathe. Rumors about his health have swirled for years, whispers that each concert might be his last, But time and again, he defies those expectations, stepping onto stages with the same quiet fire that carried him through cotton fields as a boy and IRS raids as a man. His voice is softer now, more weathered, yet every note feels heavier, as though the decades themselves have settled into his songs, giving them the kind of weight that only comes from surviving everything. His legacy is not simply in the albums or the platinum records. It is in the resilience, the stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender might have been easier. At 92, Willie Nelson's greatest achievement may not be his music, but the fact that he is still here, still standing, still strumming through storms that would have broken anyone else. His life is proof that legends are not born. They are forged in fire, loss, and relentless willpower. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: the final chapters of his story are still being written. What remains to be revealed in these twilight years may not just add to his legend, it may define it. Because if there is one thing Willie Nelson has taught the world, it's that the road never truly ends. It bends, it twists, it breaks you. But if you keep walking, sometimes it carries you to places even legends never dreamed they would reach. And so, as the curtain slowly lowers on Willie Nelson's remarkable journey, we are left with more than songs. We are left with a testament to human resilience. From abandoned child to outlaw poet, from financial ruin to cultural icon, Willie has carried storms that would have crushed others and turned them into music that heals generations. At 92, he is still strumming, still standing, still proving that legends are not measured by perfection, but by survival. His story reminds us that behind every soft smile and gentle note lies a weight we may never fully see. What do you think? Is Willie Nelson's greatest legacy his music, or the fact that he never stopped walking through the fire? Share your thoughts below. And if his voice has ever touched your life, consider leaving a like as a small tribute to a man who gave the world everything and still hasn't stopped giving. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the next story that will shock you just as much as this one.